They were young, fearless, and prepared. Every step of their journey was meticulously planned. The mountains ahead were cold, silent, and endless. Just another test of endurance for a group that had conquered worse. But this time, they were wrong. This time, they never returned. Their bodies were found weeks later, scattered, half-dressed, broken, some with crushed bones, others missing their eyes and tongues. No footprints of an attacker, no struggle, no explanation. The official report was sealed, witnesses silenced, the families left with nothing but questions, and those who dared to investigate, they met their own untimely ends. Even now, decades later, whispers persist. Was it a military experiment? A force beyond human comprehension? Or something older, something buried deep within the ice, waiting? This is the story of the lost expedition of Mount Holveth, and it remains one of the most chilling, unsolved mysteries in modern history. January 1959. 9 experienced trekkers from the University of Altov set out on a skiing expedition into the frigid wilderness of the Verkhoyan Range. Their leader, Daniel Ilyanov, was respected, calculated, and trusted. The group was hand-picked, each member strong, resourceful, and trained for extreme conditions. This was not a reckless adventure. It was a carefully mapped-out challenge. Their goal, to reach the remote peak of Mount Holveth, a region untouched, unnamed, and almost completely unknown. Locals called it Dead Man's Crest, but the group dismissed the superstition. After all, they were rational people. They believed in science, in preparation, in the limits of the human body, but no amount of preparation could have saved them from what happened next. The last known photograph of the group showed them smiling, standing against the endless white expanse. Confident, unshaken, they had no idea it would be their final image. Weeks later, search teams stumbled upon something beyond comprehension. Their tent, half buried in the snow, slashed open from the inside, bare footprints leading into the darkness. Their bodies, found one by one, twisted and broken in ways no human should be. And the most terrifying detail, some of them were found with their hands raised, as if shielding themselves from something unseen. Before we continue, a disclaimer. The stories presented on this channel are based on real events, but names, locations, and certain circumstances have been changed to maintain confidentiality. Any resemblance to real individuals, living or deceased, is purely coincidental. The purpose of this video is to examine the known facts and the many theories surrounding this event. The investigation was rushed, the conclusions vague. Officials labeled it an accident, but the people who found the bodies, they knew better. The rescuers who stepped onto that mountain came back with stories of strange lights in the sky, of an unnatural silence, of something that felt wrong, watching. And so, the case was closed. No further questions, no further answers. But the mystery of Mount Holveth still lingers, frozen in time. A story buried in snow and shadow, waiting. They called it an expedition of endurance, a test of will against the frozen heart of Siberia. 9 trekkers, young, determined, and unafraid, pushing forward into the unknown. But what they didn't know was that something was waiting for them. Something that had been there long before their footprints disturbed the untouched snow. Something watching, listening, and when the moment was right, it made its move. Days later they were found, but not the way their families had hoped. Some had their skulls crushed as if by an invisible force. Others lay half buried in the snow, their bodies twisted in agony. And then there were those who had no eyes, no tongue. The rescue team couldn't comprehend what they were seeing. The officials who arrived later refused to discuss it. And as the years passed, those who asked too many questions learned to stay silent. The last words written in their journal were simple. "We are in good spirits, everything is fine. But if that were true, why did they abandon their tent in the dead of night? Why did they flee barefoot into the cold, as if running from something even worse than the freezing air? This was no accident. This was something else. This is the story of the lost expedition of Mount Holveth, a story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about fear. 9 trekkers, 9 different lives, all converging on a single journey that would end in ways none of them could have imagined. Leading the expedition was Daniel Ilyanov, 23 years old, disciplined, calculated. He had led similar hikes before, always meticulous in his planning. He believed preparation was the key to survival. But this time, preparation wouldn't be enough. Alongside him was Elena Morozova, 21, bright, spirited, studying medicine. She carried a journal, documenting every moment of their adventure, never knowing her final entry would become evidence in a case with no answers. Then there was Sergei Antonov, 24, a former athlete, always pushing his limits. He had survived harsher climates, climbed higher peaks. He laughed at fear, but on that last night, even he ran. The rest were a mix of students and graduates from the University of Altov: Oleg, Marina, Viktor, Natalia, Ivan, and Alexei, each with their own reasons for joining, their own dreams and ambitions, but none of them would leave that mountain alive. They were strong, smart, experienced. They had maps, supplies, and a plan, but all of that meant nothing when faced with what waited in the dark. The Verkhoyan Range, an endless expanse of white, stretching as far as the eye can see. Beautiful, but deadly. Temperatures could drop to minus 30 degrees Celsius overnight. The winds howled like something alive, tearing through the valleys, shaping the land into an endless, shifting maze of ice and rock. There were no towns, no villages, just miles of silence, broken only by the crunch of boots on frozen ground. The nearest human settlement was days away. If something went wrong, there would be no rescue, no escape. Local hunters avoided this area. They spoke of shadows that moved against the snow, of strange lights flickering in the distance. But the hikers weren't superstitious. They trusted logic, reason, science. What they didn't understand was that out here, in this untouched place, logic had no power. The first few days went exactly as planned. They took photos, smiling faces against the endless white. They laughed, joked, wrote in their journals. Each night, they gathered around a small fire, their breath curling into the cold air, speaking of what they'd do when they returned home. The trip of a lifetime, one of them wrote. We'll talk about this for years to come. But something changed on the 4th night. A shift in the wind, a heaviness in the air. Elena wrote in her journal, strange noises outside the tent tonight, like whistling, but no wind. Then came the footprints, not theirs, not human. The final photograph shows them standing together, staring at the camera. The expression on their faces is hard to read, a mixture of exhaustion and something else, something deeper, unspoken. The last diary entry is even more unsettling. We are in good spirits. Everything is fine. Hours later, they would be running for their lives, their tent slashed open from the inside, their bodies scattered across the snow. No witnesses, no answers. Something happened that night. Something that made them flee into the cold, half-dressed, barefoot, knowing it meant death. The question is, what? At first, no one was alarmed. The trek was supposed to take 2 weeks. Delays were common. The weather was unpredictable. But as the days stretched into silence, that silence became unbearable. Families wrote letters, no response. Calls were made, no word. The university, hesitant at first, finally admitted something was wrong. The hikers should have returned days ago, but the mountain had swallowed them whole. A search team was assembled, volunteers, students, local mountaineers, and finally the authorities, reluctant, dismissive, but bound by duty. They expected frostbite, exhaustion, maybe an accident, someone injured, the group delayed. They didn't expect what they found. It was the 18th day when they reached the base of Mount Holveth, and there, half buried in the snow, was the first sign. The tent. It stood alone, half collapsed, battered by the wind. The entrance was sealed under a layer of ice as if no one had gone in or out for days. But then someone noticed. The fabric had been sliced open, from the inside. Not unzipped, not torn by the elements, cut, as if the people inside had been desperate to escape. But escape from what? They stepped closer. Inside, everything was untouched. Blankets, food, boots lined up neatly, journals, a flask, still half full. It was as if the hikers had just disappeared. Then someone pointed to the snow. Footprints. Barefoot, leading away from the tent. Not scattered, not chaotic. A single, orderly line. As if they had walked into the night willingly, without hesitation. Into temperatures that would freeze exposed skin in minutes. But they never came back. They followed the prints for nearly a mile before they disappeared into the white. Then at the edge of the tree line, they saw them. Two bodies, Sergei Antonov and Viktor Lavrov, face down in the snow, almost naked. Their hands were raw, covered in frostbite. Beneath them, the ground was disturbed, shallow pits, torn at with their fingers, as if they had tried to dig into the frozen earth itself. Above them, the branches of an old cedar tree hung bare, stripped of bark, claw marks dug deep into the wood, as if something or someone had tried to climb in a blind, desperate panic. Then came the next three: Daniel Ilyanov, Elena Morozova, Marina Kozlova, scattered, sprawled across the snow, facing the direction of the camp, as if they had tried, against all reason, to return. Frozen in motion, mouths open, eyes staring into nothing. The rescuers hesitated. 5 bodies, but there were 9 hikers. The others were still missing. Weeks passed. The snow deepened, but the search didn't stop. And then, 2 months later, they found them. A ravine, deep, hidden beneath layers of ice and rock, and inside it, 4 bodies, huddled together as if in their final moments they had clung to each other for warmth. But warmth had never been enough. Oleg, Natalia, Ivan, Alexei. Their injuries were not from the cold. They were not from falling. Their ribs shattered, their skulls fractured, not by impact, not by any force known to medical science. Their bones had been crushed from the inside, as if something had reached inside their bodies and squeezed. And then, there was Natalia. When they turned her over, something was missing. Her tongue, her eyes, gone. Not torn, not chewed. Simply gone. 9 hikers entered the mountain. 9 never returned. No struggle, no signs of attack, just silence, and footprints leading into the night, ending where the world refused to give answers. Whatever happened that night, it was not an accident. It was not misfortune. It was something else. Something that still waits on that mountain, beneath the snow, beneath the silence, watching, listening, and perhaps waiting for someone new to follow those same footprints into the dark. It was the simplest answer, the one that made sense on paper. Hypothermia. When the body begins to freeze, the brain misinterprets the sensation, confusing cold with heat. Victims strip off their clothes, unaware that death is creeping closer with every second. But that explanation, logical, clinical, failed to answer one question. Why were some of their bones shattered? Why did some suffer injuries comparable to a car crash, while others were found untouched, as if they had simply laid down in the snow and given in? It wasn't just undressing. It was desperation, a frantic attempt to flee. But from what? Hypothermia explains the cold. It doesn't explain the fear. Then came the next theory, the one authorities landed on the hardest, an avalanche. A wall of snow roaring down the mountainside, catching the hikers in the dead of night, crushing them, burying them beneath its weight. That would explain the broken ribs, the fractured skulls, the sheer brutal force that had crushed them from the inside. But there was a problem. No signs of an avalanche were found. The slope wasn't steep enough. The trees still stood, undisturbed. The tent was still upright, half buried, yes, but not flattened, not consumed by any rushing tide of snow. And then there were the footprints, a single-file trail leading away from the camp, orderly, deliberate. If an avalanche had struck, why were there no signs of panic? Why had they walked and not run? The official story was neat, convenient, but convenience does not explain the impossible. Then the whispers started, whispers of something far worse than nature. The Soviet Union in 1959 was a land of secrets, remote testing grounds, experiments buried beneath redacted reports, and in the Urals, far from prying eyes, the government could do whatever it wanted. The bodies told their own story, one that no one wanted to hear. Traces of radiation clung to their clothing, not from the earth, not from natural elements, but from something else, something man-made. Some of the families reported another anomaly, an observation dismissed, ignored, laughed away. Before the bodies were sealed in coffins, some parents noticed their children's skin had changed, a strange, unnatural tan, as if they had been exposed to something no one would name. And then there were the witnesses, hunters, locals, men who had seen something in the sky that night. Orange orbs, silent, moving with precision, hovering above the mountains before vanishing into the dark. Some believed it was a test gone wrong, that a weapon, one never meant to be acknowledged, was fired upon them. Others believed they had seen something else entirely, something not of this world. But whatever it was, it left no survivors. Or maybe the enemy wasn't outside the tent. Maybe it was inside their own minds. Infrasound, a frequency too low for human ears to detect, but one that can wreak havoc on the body, inducing fear, hallucinations, paranoia so intense it turns friends into enemies, reason into madness. It happens when the wind moves just right, slipping through the mountains, creating an invisible wave that the brain cannot understand. It has been known to drive men to panic, to strip away logic and leave only one command: run. But could it have been enough to make them abandon their camp, to rip through their own tent in terror, to flee into the night with nothing but bare skin and blind fear? And if it did, if this was nothing more than the mind betraying itself, why were some of them crushed? Why were some of them mutilated? Fear does not shatter bones. It does not take tongues. It does not leave behind footprints that vanish into nothing. If they had turned on each other, where were the defensive wounds, the struggle, the blood? Fear can do many things, but it does not explain everything. And then there were the stories, the ones no one wanted to put on paper, the ones that, if spoken aloud, invited only ridicule. The locals had a name for the mountain. They never spoke it at night. They warned strangers not to go too far, not to stray from the paths, because there was something in those woods, something that had been there long before the first settlers arrived, something that did not belong to man. The footprints, at least the ones they could explain, were human, but some were not. Legends spoke of creatures that stalked the mountains, the Menk, the wild ones, the watchers in the dark. Stories of hikers vanishing, of campsites left undisturbed, except for the absence of life, of something massive, covered in thick white fur, moving silently between the trees. Something that did not chase, but waited, watched, and when the time was right, struck without warning. Was that why their injuries had no external wounds, as if something had gripped them, crushed them, but never left a mark? Or was it something worse, a force that had no name, something that did not break in, did not attack, but simply called them out, and one by one they followed. 9 hikers, 9 bodies, and no answers. And so, the question remains. What happened on that mountain? Was it the cold? An avalanche? A weapon? Something beyond our understanding? Or did they see something that night? Something they were never meant to see? Whatever it was, the mountain remembers. And maybe, just maybe, it's waiting for someone else to listen. The case should have ended when the bodies were buried. It should have been written off as a tragic accident, a miscalculation against nature's fury. But instead, the deeper one looks, the more the questions refuse to be silenced. None of the theories, not a single one, explains everything. Some answer fragments, pieces of the puzzle, but the picture remains incomplete. If it was an avalanche, where was the debris? Why was the tent still standing? Why did they walk away calmly instead of running for their lives? If hypothermia led to paradoxical undressing, then what about the shattered bones? The crushed ribs with no external wounds? What kind of force could exert such power without leaving a mark? If military experiments were responsible, why wasn't there a single sign of an explosion? Why no blast injuries, no scorched earth? And what kind of weapon leaves traces of radiation, but only on some of the hikers? If infrasound played tricks on their minds, why did their footprints show no sign of panic? They left the tent in an orderly fashion, as if drawn by something compelling, something inescapable. And if it was something else entirely, something beyond science, beyond logic, what was it? What did they see out there in the dark? And why did none of them come back to tell the story? Even in death, the hikers were not allowed to rest. Their funerals were hushed, the details of their injuries omitted from reports. Family members were given strict instructions. Do not ask questions. Do not investigate. Let it go. But they couldn't. Some of the families noticed details the officials had overlooked, or perhaps chosen to ignore. One mother recalled seeing her son's body before burial. His hair, once dark, had turned ghostly white. Another noticed her daughter's hands, fingernails torn, fingertips worn down, as if she had clawed at something, or something had clawed at her. Then there were the documents, classified, redacted, kept out of public reach for decades. Even when they were finally released, pages were missing, sections blacked out, and in the margins of some reports, cryptic notes scrawled hastily in a bureaucratic hand. Unresolved. Close file. A message disguised as a conclusion, but unresolved is not the same as forgotten. Those who ventured to the site years later spoke of an unease that settled in the bones, a silence too perfect, too unnatural. Animals avoided the area. Equipment malfunctioned without reason. And at night, in the distance, some swore they saw flickering lights, orange, glowing, watching. There were whispers that the case was never meant to be solved, that someone, or something, ensured it remained buried. It remained just like the 9 hikers who had stepped onto that cursed mountain all those years ago. Even now, the questions remain. What really happened that night? Did they see something they weren't supposed to? Or did something see them? And if it did, is it still waiting?